this is Ben Dutter, lead writer of Vagabonds of Dyfed, my new game that just came out, available on DriveThruRPG. I tried to pair the OSR with Powered by the Apocalypse games, and I want to run through the book today. So starting with the cover, you can see some beautiful artwork here by Per Fulmer, and this is a print-on-demand copy that I printed from DriveThru, so it'll be just like this if you order it through their print-on-demand service. There's also a soft cover copy as well, but today we'll go through the hardcover. So inside, I tried to make the table of contents as detailed as possible. As you can see, I have the list of the full character abilities and all of the larger sections, as well as monsters and traps and dungeoneering and so forth. So right away, we just kind of jump into the basics, and I cover a bit around, if you're familiar with other games, other Powered by the Apocalypse games especially, such as World of Dungeons, this will be familiar to you as far as the core mechanic is concerned. Similarly, a lot of the math is based off of the old BX style of D&D, so Moldvay Edit Edition. We go over the principles that the game tries to emulate, what makes it specifically an OSR game, and kind of the things that the GM are expected to follow. Some more detail on the core mechanic. So then from there we get right into character creation, and this is where Vagabond starts to get a little bit different. Characters are primarily a list of trait tags, and the player actually defines what those traits are, so they can just be a short phrase, and I have an example here of creating a pyromancer, like a fire wizard. So this goes on a little bit example traits, each of the main trait types: approach, goal, your gimmick, which is sort of like a calling card or something that's really memorable about your character, your background, your foreground, sort of what you do now versus what you used to do, and then something that you are not very good at, your weakness. And when those traits are relevant, they add to your 2d6 roll. So instead of using like a strength dexterity type system with attributes, you stack your trait bonuses, which was heavily inspired from City of Mist, which is another great Powered by the Apocalypse game. Highly recommend it. So then we go through all the different lineages, nothing too surprising here. These are sort of a placeholder for your race. Each of the lineages has some specific abilities, which goes into the main meat of the game as far as character abilities are concerned, which is what we call techniques. And if you're familiar with other Powered by the Apocalypse games, techniques are basically moves. If you're more familiar with the OSR or D&D type games, then these would replace a lot of spells, special powers, or feats in later editions. So these are kind of like you pick one at first level and they really flesh out your character. So there's quite a lot of techniques, and they cover all of the main kind of tropes and character types that you would want in old school sort of skullduggery, rogues and wizards and that sort of thing. So then we get into gameplay, and this really kind of goes into all of the specifics, very procedural, with lots of examples, and then I also include some of these under the hood sidebars, which just explain some more around the design thinking if you're into that sort of thing. I also tried to have as many examples as possible, so for every single rule, there's an example text for that. There's stance, which is a sort of a riff off of Blades in the Dark. And then this also uses an advantage and disadvantage system, so you would roll 3 dice and take either the best or the worst. Concentration is important for spell casting. There's a section on how the GM can control permissions and keep the focus on the game really narrow. One other thing is engaging with your core flaw. So when you create your character, each character has a core flaw, and that's something that is really endemic to what defines them as a person. It's not just that they have bad eyesight or that they're clumsy. It's something where they truly are hindered by this flaw. The way I describe it is a lie about the world that they choose to believe. So something that is personal and motivates them. So there's a specific mechanic around engaging with your core flaw, which gets you into or out of trouble depending on the circumstances. And then we go into more detail on all the different aspects of your character. So this would be sort of like the player's handbook section of the book itself. After you are done creating your character, this goes through all the specific mechanics that a player would need to know and how to handle it. There's a pretty shallow level curve, only 6 levels, and that's intentional. And as you gain levels, the amount that you improve is pretty minor. So you just more so get more tools, more techniques. There's not a lot of math. And then we get into the NPC section. So we go over how to make non-player characters, enemies, hirelings, as well as animal companions or hounds and horses. There's a very simple loyalty mechanic where you can command an NPC to do something and you roll with their loyalty. From there, there's a relatively straightforward section on combat. And again, it just goes over the basics here, dealing with surprise, how turn order works, which it's a little bit stricter than most PBTA games, but a little bit looser than most OSR games. There is a speed mechanic that's based upon how much equipment and weapons you're carrying at the time, and that can affect when you act in initiative, as well as how quickly you can move in and out of danger. One of the things that's a bit unique about Vagabonds is how the damage system works. So when characters roll, it's based upon the lowest D6 result within their 2D6 roll that they determined with their task challenge, plus whatever their bonus was. So it kind of makes sense if you rolled really high that you do more damage, and there's some variability there. So it's all kind of seamless within one roll. There's also a critical hit component, and this makes the game much faster, especially as the characters start to get higher in level and their aptitude, their bonus is more consistently applied. You start hitting critical hits a lot more frequently, and that essentially just straight up doubles your damage. There's also a very short system here, but around defeating enemies without dealing specific damage to them, such as through morale. The PCs taking damage is also based on the player's roll. In Vagabonds, the GM never rolls unless they are trying to do some sort of random encounter or something like that. So PCs take damage primarily based on how well that they rolled to defend themselves, as well as with armor. We have a section around outside of adventure. So this includes your downtime scenes and your social scenes, just a little bit of extra context around how to run those scenes as the GM. And one of the things with downtime scenes is that you're able to kind of do these specific tasks while you're in town, and they each have sort of a different benefit and drawback, which this was inspired from Blades in the Dark. Brief section on travel and dungeoneering, so being out in the wilderness or being in a dungeon. There's some general rules around different roles you can take while you're traveling over what's called the travel turn. There's a table here associated with those roles, how you can be affected by weather or other sort of environmental hazards. I have a couple different ways to do that. And then we also have a preparation and planning mechanic that allows you to kind of breeze through some of the things which most OSR games are really fond of all the details, but with Vagabond, sometimes I've found that if you want to just play a quick 1-hour session, it's really helpful to have this prep roll. So there's some guidelines for that. A bit on traps. There's a section here on what are called decays, which is just sort of a catch-all term for things like starvation, dying of disease, being poisoned, magical curses, stuff like that. There's also a bit around overland travel, how many miles you can cover in a day based on your speed and how much you're carrying. Magic is handled in a pretty freeform way in Vagabonds. There's also a bit of magical MacGuffin juice that I call Azoth. It's just sort of a catch-all for anything that you can use for magic. So another section on equipment. Equipment basically just function like tags, so they're very similar to traits. There are special weapon tags as well, which are like trait tags, but for the equipment itself. Then I have some examples of common equipment and weapons. Pretty straightforward though, not a ton of difference between the different weapons, just more contextual benefits. And then I have a list here of kits, which are just sort of a catch-all. So somebody can say, oh, I want to be a rogue, so I'm just going to take the thief's kit. And that assumes that they have everything that they need. A bit around currency. And then this is the most useful section, arguably, for the GM with trying to convert or create enemies that are compatible between all of the different OSR games and Vagabonds. So there's a bit of information here if you're trying to create an enemy from scratch. It doesn't take too long. Once you get the hang of it, maybe about 30 seconds to kind of wing it, because there's these simple sort of tiers of power. And since the characters are only between levels 1 and 6, their power curve is relatively shallow as well. So there's not a ton of HP bloat or anything like that. Just like techniques for player characters, I have a list of abilities for monsters, enemies, and NPCs. And so these are what allow the monsters to actually do and affect things beyond just fictional positioning and dealing damage. Then we have a section on converting enemies from different games and editions. Most of the time, you're just going to ignore anything that has to do with the D20 roll, but everything else, all the math sort of ladders into it. So your hit points, your damage modifiers, any sort of morale effects, things like that. And then there's a relatively comprehensive but brief list around some kind of must-have enemies with a very easy to read stat block so that you can just quickly kind of skim through it. And they are alphabetical rather than by level, which if you know what you're looking for is a little bit faster. Some of them, as you can see, are much simpler, like a goblin, compared to like the Hydra. A lot of excellent interior artwork, again, by Per Fulmer and Dean Spencer. So then we're almost to the end here, and these are sort of just your ready-to-play character archetypes, which you can just print this whole sheet off and write right into it if you want. If you get the PDF, this is also, there's blank sheets for these too. But this actually even has a light gray kind of recommended advancement. So as you go through the levels, you can pick these different abilities as you gain new powers. So there's the Adventurer, the Avowed, which is sort of like a cleric, paladin hybrid, mage, so on and so forth. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with the print quality. We upgraded to the 70-pound paper, which is the thickest paper that Drive-Thru's printer offers. There's a very small amount of bleed on some of the really black images, especially like if it's one of these chapter headers, but for the most part, it's very substantial. The construction quality is solid for both the hardcover and the softcover. So that's Vagabonds of Dyfed. Thanks for watching.